The cooks aboard the RMS Titanic made hundreds of exquisite dishes, mainly for the first class, and so those passengers could enjoy every course, they often included a palate cleanser, like this recipe for punch romaine. And we'll learn about a group of these cooks and exactly what happened to them on that cold April night in the North Atlantic. Punch romaine and the cooks of Titanic, this time on Tasting History. So this was supposed to be a drinking history because we're making punch, but it is unlike any punch that you would have today. It's more like an alcoholic sorbet. So it's not really a drinking history episode, though later interpretations do make it into just a plain cocktail, which is a lot easier, but we're doing it the hard way, and that would be Escoffier's way. Mix dry champagne in 5 deciliters of syrup. Add the juice of 2 oranges and 3 lemons and a thin strip each of orange and lemon zest. Cover and allow to infuse for 1 hour. Pass through a strainer. Freeze the punch in the machine until it's fairly stiff, then mix in 1/4 of its quantity of Italian meringue. When about to serve, finish the punch with rum added a little at a time. By the way, I have trouble saying the name of this recipe without wanting to place it into the melody of Quiche Lorraine by the B-52s. Punch, punch romaine. Anyway, for this recipe what you'll need is 1 3/4 cup or 425 milliliters of dry champagne, 1/4 cup or 60 milliliters of simple syrup, 1/4 cup of orange juice, 1/4 cup of lemon juice, small strips of orange and lemon zest, 1 egg white, 1/4 cup or 50 grams of sugar, 1/4 cup or 60 milliliters of water, and a little rum. I am using Smith & Cross, which is one of my favorites, and I'll put a link in the description to where you can get that, but any rum will do. So first, mix the champagne with the syrup until dissolved. It helps if the syrup is a little warm, and then add the orange and lemon juice and the strips of orange and lemon zest. And then cover the pot and let it infuse for 1 hour. After an hour, you can either strain it, or if it doesn't actually need straining, you can just take out the lemon and orange zest. Then pour the punch into an ice cream maker and let it do its thing. Now it's not going to thicken as much as a normal sorbet. Even Escoffier says just let it thicken until it's fairly stiff. It'll be more like a very thick slushy. But while it's freezing, go ahead and make your Italian meringue. Add the sugar and the water into a saucepan and set over high heat, and then don't touch it. Don't stir it, don't swirl it, don't even look at it, because if you do, it will get crystals, and if it gets even 1 crystal, it's pretty much ruined and you have to start all over again. You're looking for it to get to 240 degrees Fahrenheit, and if you just leave it, it'll do that in about 4 to 5 minutes. While it heats, beat your egg white in a clean bowl until you have soft peaks, and then with the beaters still going, slowly pour in the melted syrup. Then beat on high for 4 to 5 minutes until you have nice, shiny, stiff peaks. Then, assuming that your champagne sorbet is ready, you can go ahead and fold a bit of the Italian meringue into it, about 1/4 of the total amount of sorbet. This is going to kind of undo a lot of the freezing that you did and just make it into kind of a slush, but that's okay because then you're going to mix it together and put it into the freezer for about 3 hours and it'll firm up real nice. Now this was served in the first class dining saloon on the last night aboard the Titanic. And something identical, or at least very similar, would have been served to the passengers eating in the a la carte restaurant, which was another restaurant on the ship, and it's the staff of that restaurant that we're going to discuss right now. So if you were a first-class passenger and decided that the first-class dining saloon just wasn't nice enough for you, and you wanted to spend a little more money, then you could opt to eat at the a la carte restaurant, run independently by the Italian restaurateur Luigi Gatti, who ran Odinino's Imperial Restaurant in London. Many of the 60 staff members that he had aboard the Titanic, including 10 of his cousins, came from that restaurant. Most of his Titanic staff were Italian, French, or Swiss, and they held kind of a weird place amongst the crew of the ship, because they weren't passengers, but they also weren't really White Star Line employees. And while it's not definite, this separation from the rest of the crew may have had something to do with their fate during the sinking. Now, as for the restaurant itself, sometimes called the Ritz by the passengers, it had capacity for only 137 guests, so it was seen as a bit more exclusive than even the first-class saloon, especially because meals at this restaurant were not included in the price of your ticket. So it was on George Widener's tab when he hosted a dinner party on that last night of April 14th. But don't worry, he could afford it, for as the opening of the Titanic musical reminds us, he's the richest man in Philadelphia, and he was. In fact, he owned the Ritz Hotel in that city. So it's no surprise that guests of he and his wife Eleanor that night included some of the wealthy Philadelphians on board the Titanic. They were also joined by Major Archibald Butt, who was President Taft's close friend and military aide, and supposedly their guest of honor was Captain E.J. Smith himself, there to celebrate this, his last crossing of an illustrious career with an impeccable safety record. But it's not the diners of the restaurant that we're here to discuss, but rather the cooks and the waiters and the cashiers, and a man named Paul Mauger, who was the assistant to the head chef Pierre Rousseau. Now, most of what we know about what happened to the staff that night comes from Paul Mauger. He seems to have been the only staff member who went up onto the deck after the ship had hit the iceberg and saw ice on the deck. He also saw Captain Smith urging a woman into a lifeboat, and so he knew that something was not right, but a steward told him, as he didn't have any official duties and he wasn't a passenger, that he needed to return to his cabin. Well, he went down, but he didn't return to his cabin. Rather, he woke up Chef Rousseau. And Chef Rousseau, he says, was rather agitated at being woken up with such alarming news, but eventually he got him to put on some clothes. And both of them were in regular clothes rather than their uniforms. So they start upstairs, and by now they're joined by the cooks and the waiters of the restaurant. But as the restaurant had just closed, they're all still in their work uniforms, and Paul Mauger says that there are stewards blocking their way, not letting them up onto the deck. Mauger demands that they let them pass, but the stewards only let Mauger and Pierre Rousseau pass, and Mauger says that it was because they weren't dressed as cooks, but were wearing clothes that made them look like passengers. Then he testified that the other cooks were obliged to stay on the deck there. They could not go up. That is where they die. 20 cooks and 40 waiters. He and the chef waited for about a half an hour, hoping that others would make it through, but nobody did, and eventually they decided they had to go up on deck. And by this time, panic was starting to set in, yet they were still lowering lifeboats not entirely full. As one of those boats was lowering, Mauger saw that other men were jumping into the boat. And now it was about 10 feet down, but he decided to jump and landed in the boat. And he looked up at the chef and shouted, "Saute, saute, jump, jump!" But the chef, who was a large man, said, "No, I won't jump," and he never did. Of the 69 staff of the a la carte restaurant, Paul Mauger and 2 female cashiers who had rooms amongst the passengers were the only ones to survive. And the day after he testified to the inquiry, a headline ran, "Titanic cooks drowned like rats." Now, while I can't relate to their situation that night, I can relate to the unbelievable work that the cooks and waiters aboard the Titanic did. I've worked on ships and I worked in restaurants for much of my life, and seeing the work that cooks go through every single night at a restaurant is mind-boggling. It's got to be one of the hardest jobs in the world. And I'd say let's raise a toast with a cocktail to the amazing restaurant workers aboard the Titanic, but I don't have a cocktail, rather I have a palate cleanser. So we'll raise a toast with a palate cleanser of punch romaine. So once it's chilled for a few hours, scoop the punch romaine into a chilled glass. You can top it with a bit more of the meringue for presentation, and then pour a bit of cold rum around the base. And here we are, punch romaine, the first-class palate cleanser aboard the Titanic. It really is like a little alcoholic sorbet. You can definitely smell the rum, and it is quickly turning into just total liquid. It doesn't have a long shelf life, so let's give it a try. Oh, it's quite alcoholic. They had wine with every single course, and before dinner drinks and after dinner drinks. These people must have been sloshed. I'm gonna taste just, the rum kind of overpowers everything. So I'm gonna taste just a little bit of the sorbet alone. I like that. Oh, that's very, very good. So you really get the champagne, but then you also get the orange and, you know, that zesty citrusness, and it's sweet. It is a dessert, but a super, super boozy dessert. But the one thing it does make you feel is just fancy, just first class. So make sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and follow the Discord and Reddit. I'll put links in the description where you can continue the conversation about the Titanic and other Tasting History episodes. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. Today we are delving into the experience of the crew members aboard the RMS Titanic. And while most of the food that they ate was pretty simple, the food they prepared was definitely not. Like this sirloin of beef with chateau potatoes and béarnaise. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we tackle the ship's crew and make one of the most complex dishes I've ever made on this channel. This time on Tasting History. Now, while most of the crew ate pretty simply on the Titanic, there were a couple who got to dine first class. Literally. Both Captain Smith and the ship's purser Hugh Walter McElroy had their own tables in the first-class dining saloon. And at the very last meal served aboard Titanic, the fifth course included sirloin of beef with chateau potatoes. Now, the menu does not mention any sauce that was served with it, but we know that it would have been served with sauce because pretty much everything was served with sauce. So as the menu was largely based on the cuisine of Auguste Escoffier, I looked through his recipes and it just so happens that he has a recipe for sirloin of beef with chateau potatoes, and he says it should be served with béarnaise sauce. Entrecôte à la béarnaise. Season and grill the sirloin steaks. Place on a long oval hot dish. At each end of the dish, place a bouquet of small pommes chateau, brush the steaks lightly with some light meat glaze, and finally border each steak with thick sauce béarnaise. So it sounds simple, but it is not. In fact, it is probably the most complicated thing that I've ever made here on the channel because not only do we have to make the steak and the potatoes, we have to make two sauces, the meat glaze and the béarnaise. Escoffier describes the meat glaze as a brown stock that has been reduced. The glaze is ready when it adheres to the back of a spoon in the form of a glossy coating. Though even making that brown stock to reduce is quite a feat, so I purchased brown stock and will let it reduce on low heat for about 4 hours until it coats the back of a spoon. And since it takes so long, you can pretty much let it do its thing while you make the rest of the dish. First, the chateau potatoes. Trim the potatoes to the shape of large olives, place them in a shallow pan, season and cook slowly in clarified butter until very soft and golden brown. Arrange in a deep dish and sprinkle with chopped parsley. So for those, I suggest using 1 pound or 450 grams small golden potatoes and a couple tablespoons of clarified butter or ghee. The hardest part about making the chateau potatoes is the shaping of them. You know, you're supposed to kind of cut them into the shape of olives, which I thought was going to be easy, but I was wrong. You start by cutting off the sides and the ends to make it into a rectangle, then carefully use a paring knife to carve it into an olive or barrel shape. And I'm not gonna lie, I got about a dozen done before my hand started cramping up so bad that I had to quit. And that proves that I am not a trained chef because I'm pretty sure that the cooks on Titanic could do like hundreds of them without batting an eye. So like the meat glaze, for the average home cook, shaping these potatoes is going to be rather time-consuming. The most complicated aspect of the dish, Escoffier's béarnaise. Now, I'm not going to read the entire béarnaise recipe because it is rather long, but I am going to put the whole thing in the description, along with links to the ingredients and some of my sources, as well as my Patreon page. I'm also going to follow Escoffier's exact proportions, though I'm going to cut them in half because I'm not trying to feed a whole restaurant here. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 100 milliliters of white wine, 100 milliliters of tarragon vinegar, that's vinegar infused with tarragon, 2 tablespoons of chopped shallots, 1 cup or 15 grams of tarragon leaves, roughly chopped. He actually calls for a third of those leaves to be chervil, but for some reason that herb is like being boycotted where I live. I could not find it anywhere, so I used all tarragon, which is actually more common today, but if you can find chervil, use chervil. 2 teaspoons or 2.5 grams whole peppercorns, roughly pounded, a pinch of salt, 3 large egg yolks, 2 1/4 sticks or 250 grams of butter, 3/4 of a tablespoon finely chopped tarragon, and a pinch of cayenne pepper. So add the wine and tarragon vinegar to a large saucepan and add in the roughly chopped tarragon, chopped shallots, peppercorns, and salt, and bring it to a simmer. So you're looking to reduce this down to 3 or 4 tablespoons of reduction, and it can burn at the very, very end if you're not watching it. To help regulate the process, add a little bit of water, and it just kind of helps it, and it's not going to throw off the recipe at all. Regardless though, do it at a very low temperature just to be safe. It should take at least 20 to 30 minutes. Once you have just a little liquid left, pour it through a fine mesh strainer and squeeze out any juice. You should have about 3 to 4 tablespoons, and you want to let it cool completely. You're going to be adding the egg yolks soon, and if it is still hot, then they can scramble, and that's bad. The other pitfall to this recipe is not letting it get too hot while you're cooking it because the sauce will split. Luckily, if it does split, there is a way to save it, and we'll get to that in a moment. But once your infusion is cool, pour about 3 tablespoons into a large saucepan, and add the egg yolk, then set it over low heat and add a third of the butter, whisking it in until it's fully melted. Then add another third and whisk until incorporated, and then add the rest, whisking the entire time until it starts to thicken. Now this is the time when it can very quickly go from a nice creamy sauce to completely split. And the way that you're going to save that usually is by adding more fat, either butter or preferably an egg yolk. And it's usually because it's gotten too hot, so turn down the heat and then add that egg yolk and whisk it in, and it should bring the sauce back. Sometimes the problem is actually not enough water, so you can try that as well if the egg yolk doesn't work. Now if your sauce is not perfectly smooth, that's okay, pass it through a strainer and then it will be smooth. But if it is nice and smooth, then just add in that pinch of cayenne pepper, a little salt if it needs it, and then mix in the finely chopped tarragon. Then set it aside as you make your steak and potatoes, and the potatoes are very, very easy once they're shaped. Just heat the clarified butter in a pan with a little salt and then put the potatoes in, moving them around every so often until they're soft and golden brown. This too needs to be done over low heat. It should take about 15 to 20 minutes to cook the potatoes all the way through. As for the steaks, you can do them pretty much however you want. Personally, I am grilling them on the stovetop with lots of butter and fresh tarragon. While it gets a nice crust on the bottom, spoon the butter over the top of the steaks and then flip them over and finish cooking. If your steak is really thick, like mine, you can butterfly it, but if you don't mind a really kind of a dark crust on the top and bottom, then there's no need to butterfly it and it'll get cooked all the way through and you'll just have a nice crispy crust. Now the hardest part about this is definitely timing everything because there are so many moving parts. You've got the steak, the potatoes, the béarnaise, and that meat glaze, which I'm guessing you've already forgotten about. But if you were a cook on the Titanic, you wouldn't be doing all of this yourself because you'd have a whole brigade of cooks helping you. The cooks being part of the crew that we're about to discuss right now. The Titanic had over 900 crew members on its maiden voyage, and their jobs were incredibly varied, but they all fell under 3 departments. There was the deck department, which was made up of 66 men and included the captain, officers, and sailors in charge of the ship. The engine department, led by Chief Engineer Joseph Bell. It was 325 men and in charge of generating all of the power in the ship and making the ship actually go. These included the engineers, stokers, trimmers, and greasers, and had what I think has to be the hardest job on the ship. Most worked tirelessly in 3 shifts a day in the 6 boiler rooms, keeping the furnaces stocked with coal to keep the engines running. And because of their physical location on the ship, all the way down at the bottom, and possibly because of their place in society, they had the lowest survival rate, only about 1 in 5 making it onto a lifeboat. Now the 3rd department was by far the largest department, and that was the victualling department. With 495 men and women, the only department with women, the department was led by the ship's purser and was in charge of the hotel aspects of the ship. This was most everything that affected passengers directly. The cooks, waiters, bartenders, cabin stewards, cleaners, elevator operators, those who worked in the Turkish bath, the gymnasium, the barber shop, and usually counted amongst them were the 8 musicians and the 5 postal clerks. The victualling department was also in charge of most of the security on the ship, everything from making sure people didn't smoke in non-smoking areas, to making sure that life vests were worn and that the portholes were closed on the night of the sinking. Now the name victualling department originally came from the word victuals, which meant food, and food was still the major part of the victualling department. Every day, the ship's purser would meet with the head chef and his cooks to discuss the menus of the day. Then the storekeepers would begin procuring all of the ingredients for those menus. These 8 crew members were in charge of making sure enough food was loaded onto the ship at port and then stored at the correct temperature and kept ready at all times. They mostly worked in this labyrinth of rooms on G-deck dedicated to the different ingredients. There were separate rooms for milk and butter, fruit, eggs, bacon, ham and cheese, meat, fish, and an entire room dedicated to mutton and another just to ice cream. If you're looking for me, I'll be in the ice cream room. They used a system of elevators to transport the food up to the 1st and 2nd class kitchen, or galley, and usually just walked the food over to the 3rd class galley, which was a lot closer. And in addition to supplying all the ingredients for the passengers' food, they also supplied the ingredients for the crew's food. Now I used to work on a cruise ship, and everyone seems to assume that I was up like eating at the buffet every day. I was not. I spent a year living mostly off of hot dogs, cereal, and cold French fries. And you know what? It was fantastic. But the only ones eating like the passengers were like the officers and the captain. And it was pretty much the same thing on the Titanic. See, the captain and the purser could eat in the first-class dining saloon where they each had their own table. They could also eat with the other officers in the officers' mess, which was probably served second, if not even first-class food. Most of the other crew probably ate more like the third class if they were lucky. Filling, but not fancy. The engineering department had their own mess down on E deck near their quarters and their work area. Since they worked in shifts around the clock, this mess was probably filled with engineers all day and all night. As for the victualling department, they didn't have a specific place to eat. It seems they mostly dined in the passenger dining rooms between meals, likely the third-class saloon. Though stewardess Violet Jessup wrote that when she was on the Olympic, the sister ship to the Titanic, they ate their food standing in any available corner of a greasy pantry amid steamy smells and nauseating grease-strewn decks, eaten in the quickest possible time in order to get away. Now, as unpleasant as that sounds, Violet's position on the ship wasn't unpleasant at all. She was not only a stewardess, but a first-class stewardess. Now, the term steward or stewardess on the Titanic really has a whole host of meanings and could apply to many passenger-facing jobs, from the elevator operator to the person who took your luggage when you first boarded the ship. But the two most numerous stewards were the saloon stewards, essentially a waiter, and the cabin stewards, which is what Violet Jessup was. And in either of these positions, it was paramount that you tried to work your way up to working for the first-class passengers. Because while everyone received a salary, just like in America today, a majority sometimes of their income was based on tips. A first-class saloon steward could earn up to 4 times what their third-class counterpart made. Now, a saloon steward's position is fairly self-explanatory. Just think of the very best server at the best restaurant ever following you from meal to meal and being there for absolutely every bite and drink that you take. The cabin stewards, on the other hand, are something that we're not really accustomed to today. They were highly trained in the Edwardian style of service, think Downton Abbey, and each one looked after between 6 and 12 cabins and their occupants. They were in charge of keeping the rooms clean and stocked with hot water and other amenities. Working in pairs, taking shifts, they watched over the cabins day and night as the passengers did not have keys to their own rooms. They also polished passengers' shoes free of charge, delivered meals to the room if a passenger decided to take their meal in their cabin, changed the sheets and towels daily, at least in first and second class, and for a fee they took passengers' clothes to the laundry on F deck to be washed and pressed. This was the only laundry that was actually done on Titanic because there were only 3 laundry stewards. Everything else, the towels, blankets, sheets, napkins, and tablecloths, were all washed on shore. Now, while a cabin steward's work wasn't as backbreaking as that person shoveling coal into a furnace, their schedule was probably the most grueling, as it often started at 5:30 a.m. and didn't finish until midnight, 7 days a week. And it's actually still that way on a lot of cruise ships today. Now, with that kind of schedule, Violet Jessup was on hand to rouse her first-class passengers and instruct them to don their life vests shortly after the Titanic hit an iceberg at 11:20 p.m. on April 14th. She wrote that, as she was from Argentina, she was told to also wear her life vest as an example to those non-English speaking passengers in second and third class. But she was also told that it was just a precaution, so once she had done what she needed to do, she went back down to her bunk. Soon after, another steward, Stanley, came down and told her, "The ship is sinking and you should go out on deck so you can get onto one of the lifeboats." Then she spent quite some time deciding on what kind of jacket she might need and if she needed a hat or not. Only then did she start up the stairs toward the boat deck. Halfway up, I looked down and waved to Stan. He was standing with his arms clasped behind him in the corner where he usually kept his evening watch. He suddenly looked very tired. Of course, Stanley knew that there was no space for him on any of the lifeboats. Violet describes walking past all of the now empty first-class staterooms. How strange it was to pass all those rooms lit up so brilliantly, their doors open and contents lying around in disorder. Jewels sparkled on dressing tables and a pair of silver slippers were lying just where they had been kicked off. When she arrived back up on the boat deck, she stood waiting patiently near the boats and describes how it was as people slowly began to realize that something was really wrong. First, when distress rockets went off, and then when third-class passengers who had already seen the water below decks started coming up on deck. And finally, when a mailman casually mentioned that mail was floating as far up as F deck. But Violet was able to get into a lifeboat, and just as it started to go down, another crew member handed her something, almost tossed it, she says. It was a baby, and she held on to that baby as the lifeboat went down, as they rowed out into the dark, and as they watched the Titanic slowly go under the waves. She held that baby all through the night, and all the way onto the Carpathia, which was the ship that came to rescue them. And only after a while of being on the rescue ship, while I stood, still clutching the baby in my frozen arms, a woman rushed up, snatched the child, and ran away with it. Now, Violet Jessup's story is not all that different from many, many other people aboard the Titanic. What is a little different is that this was not her only sinking on a White Star Line vessel. See, Titanic was the second of 3 ships in the Olympic class: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. And Violet worked on all 3 of them. In 1911, when she was on the Olympic, it collided with the British warship HMS Hawke, which caused considerable damage, but it did not sink. Afterward, she switched over to the Titanic, and, well, that didn't go well. Then a few years later, she was aboard the Britannic during World War I, but this time not as a stewardess, but as a nurse, because it had become a hospital ship. There was an explosion while she was on board, probably due to it running into a mine, and the ship sank in just 55 minutes. But she was able to get into a lifeboat, but then had to jump out because the lifeboat got hit by the propellers and splintered it into a million pieces. What's weird is that not only did she survive that, but 2 others who were in the crew on that ship had also survived the Titanic with her. A stoker named Arthur John Priest and a sailor named Archie Jewell. Priest actually survived the sinking of 4 different ships. Now, of the different groups aboard the Titanic, the crew fared the worst by quite a bit. Of the 900 plus crew members, 685 perished. And on top of that tragic loss of life, the White Star Line then behaved, as you might expect, abominably. Any crew member who did survive got home to find out that at 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, as the Titanic sunk beneath the water, their employment was at an end and they would expect no pay after that moment. The brother of 6th Officer Moody received a letter from the White Star Line that reads a lot like a ransom note. "Dear Sir, should you desire the remains of your brother to be returned, kindly telegraph us, sending us a deposit of £20. That's over $2,500 today just to have his remains returned to England. And even then, Moody's body was never found, so I'm not sure whose remains they were planning on sending. And on April 30th, 1912, just 2 weeks after the sinking, the families of the musicians aboard received a letter not from White Star Line, but from the company that booked the musicians on the ship. Dear Sir, we shall be obliged if you will remit us the sum of 5 shillings 4 pence, which is owing to us as per enclosed statement. We shall also be obliged if you will settle the enclosed uniform account. Yours faithfully." That would be a bill for the uniforms that their loved ones had died in. And on that sorrowful note, let us remember the brave crew members of the RMS Titanic, some of whom would have made this wonderful dish of sirloin of beef with chateau potatoes. So once your steak and potatoes are cooked, set them on a plate and brush the steak with the meat glaze. Add a bit of the béarnaise sauce, garnish the potatoes with parsley, and serve. And here we are, sirloin of beef with chateau potatoes and béarnaise sauce, as served at the last meal aboard RMS Titanic. I love béarnaise sauce. That's ridiculously delicious. So there's this wonderful crunch to the steak, but then the inside is just so tender. And the sauce, you don't need very much because it is somewhat astringent. There is that kind of vinegar tinge to it, but it's also very creamy, and the tarragon just explodes. The flavor just explodes. It's absolutely wonderful. Also, don't neglect the meat glaze. It seems very simple, but it adds this wonderful richness to the flavor. It's like steak squared. Now for the potatoes that took me forever to carve this little thing, let's give that a shot. So soft and buttery. The fact that it's like cooked in the clarified butter or the ghee, That's fantastic. That's pretty much going to be the only way that I make potatoes from now on, actually. So yeah, it is a lot of work, this meal, but it is definitely worth it. Now, for more on Titanic's crew, watch this video, which is about the baker who survived because he got drunk, and this playlist where I'm putting all the Titanic videos. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Last year, I recreated several dishes from the last dinners aboard the Titanic, but I completely neglected the most important meal of the day, breakfast. So today, I am recreating a first-class breakfast aboard the Titanic. So, my tastorians, I ask you,
are you ready to go back to Titanic?
This time on Tasting History. First-class meals aboard the Titanic were opulent and plentiful. Dinner could be up to 11 courses if you considered the post-dessert fruit and cheese a course, which I do, of course. And while breakfast wasn't as regimented or as robust as dinner, there was still a lot of food on offer. The menu presented had dozens of options and you could order whatever you liked. Personally, I've decided on a first-class breakfast of baked apples, smoked salmon, shirred eggs, buckwheat cakes with black currant conserve and Oxford marmalade, and a bit of watercress at the end to aid in digestion. Now, there are no actual recipes from Titanic, but we do know that, especially for the first class, much of the food was based on the recipes of Auguste Escoffier. One of his greatest cookbooks, Le Guide Culinaire, has recipes for most of the dinner and lunch menu, but fewer recipes for breakfast. But he does have one for the baked apples, as well as one that describes how to present the smoked salmon. For that, he says to cut in very thin slices, trim, roll into cornets, and arrange on a dish with a little parsley. Super easy, and his baked apples are pretty simple as well. He just says to core them, leaving a bit of core at the very bottom, and then cut a thin line through the skin around the middle of the apples, then set them in a tray, and fill the center of each with a mixture of butter and castor sugar. Add a little water to the tray, and cook the apples gently in the oven. So take 4 tablespoons of softened butter and beat in a half cup of superfine sugar for the filling. Another contemporary recipe from Fanny Farmer actually says that that is all that you need in the fall. But towards spring, they become somewhat tasteless, and spice is an improvement. So she suggests adding a half teaspoon of cinnamon as well, and as Titanic sailed in the spring, that is what I did. Then fill the apples with the filling, then pour some boiling water into the dish, just enough to cover the bottom, and set the apples in the oven at 375 Fahrenheit or 190 Celsius for about an hour or until they're nice and soft but not mushy. Now, Escoffier does not have recipes for either the buckwheat cakes or the shirred eggs, but luckily Fanny Farmer, whose cookbook was selling off the charts when the Titanic sailed, does have recipes for those, so that's who I'm going to look to for those recipes. Now, Fanny Farmer's buckwheat cakes are very similar to modern pancakes, but yeasted, so instead of using baking powder to give them a rise, they use yeast. So to make these, you'll need 2 cups or 475 milliliters of milk and then scald it. Then pour it over 1/3 cup of breadcrumbs and let it soak for 30 minutes. Then once the mixture has had time to cool, add in a half teaspoon of salt and 2 teaspoons of dried yeast and stir until dissolved. Then add in the buckwheat flour. Now, Fanny is not specific on exactly how much buckwheat to add. She just says add buckwheat to make a batter thin enough to pour. For me, that was about a cup, then cover the batter, let it rise overnight, then she says, in the morning, stir well, add molasses, and cook as griddle cakes. So stir in 1 tablespoon of molasses, then pour a bit of the batter onto a hot griddle over medium heat, and let them cook for about a minute to a minute and a half before flipping them over and letting them cook for another minute. And you can make them any size that you want, but the larger they are, the harder they are to flip. Now, the last thing we have to make is the shirred eggs, but before we do so, I wanted to point out a couple of interesting little things that are on this menu for breakfast from the Titanic. First, there's a typo. The word marmalade is spelled marmalade, and the mistake was not replicated on the second-class menu, so I like to imagine that the typo was actually very much on purpose, a passive-aggressive action taken by the steward who had to spend the days working with the first class, who I assume are rather insufferable on the Titanic, and yeah. I have no evidence to back that up, but that's what I like to imagine. Second interesting thing is the date, April 11th, 1912. And that's different from most of the menus that we have, which are from April 14th, the day that the Titanic hit an iceberg. And once you hit the like button and subscribe to Tasting History, I'm going to let you know why that is. Numerous menus survive from the Titanic, and most of them are from the day of the sinking because people were still carrying them in their jacket pockets when they were taken out of the ocean and saved by the Carpathia. So for third class, we have the entire day because the entire day's meals were laid out on one menu. But for first and second class, different menus were printed for different meals, so most of what we have are from dinner that night, and then we have a few from luncheon that day. But they'd likely left their breakfast menus in their staterooms, which are now at the bottom of the Atlantic. So both the first and second class breakfast menus that survived are actually from Thursday, April 11th, because that was the day at 11:30 a.m. that Titanic arrived at Queenstown, Ireland, its last stop before heading to New York. There, RMS Titanic, being a Royal Mail ship, took on a lot of mail destined for America. But there were also a few pieces of mail that got off. These were the last postcards and letters that passengers aboard Titanic ever sent to their loved ones, and a few of them included little souvenirs, some of which were the menus from breakfast that they had had that morning. And what's cool is that besides the menus, this is really the only time that we get a glimpse into the passenger experience aboard the Titanic without the taint of the events that would happen a few days later. Like one from 20-year-old Alfred Nourney, who had actually purchased a second-class ticket, but he complained about his cabin, and as people complaining often get, he got upgraded up to first class. So he was able to send a giddy postcard to his mother from Queenstown. "Dear Mother, I am so happy being first class. I already know some nice people. A Diamond King, Mr. Astor, one of the wealthiest Americans, is on board. 1,000 kisses, Alfred." A less giddy letter was sent to a friend by eminent American painter, writer, and curmudgeon Francis Millet. "Queer lot of people on this ship. There are a number of obnoxious, ostentatious American women. The scourge of any place they infest, and worse on shipboard than anywhere. Many of them carry tiny dogs and lead husbands around like pet lambs." And he wasn't wrong. There were a number of first-class ladies who did bring their little dogs with them. There were actually 12 dogs on board, most of whom spent their days in the kennel on F deck, though 4 of the smaller dogs would stay in the cabins with their owners. Now 3 of these dogs being kept in the cabins were the only dogs to survive the sinking, and even then, in one case of the Pomeranian Lady, she was only able to get onto a lifeboat because her owner wrapped her up like a baby, and the crew member thought it was a little baby she was carrying. "I have a child!" And supposedly, when saved by the Carpathia, those crew members didn't want at least one of the dogs to come aboard, but luckily, all 3 dogs did get off the lifeboats and onto the Carpathia and survived. But the 4th dog, Frou Frou, who did stay in a cabin, he did not survive because his owner, Helen Bishop, later wrote, "The loss of my little dog hurt me very much. I will not forget how he dragged on my clothes. He so wanted to accompany me." But there would be little sympathy for a woman carrying a dog in her arms when there were lives of women and children to be saved. There's a sad story, the veracity of which is somewhat suspect, of Anne Elizabeth Isham. Now, she had gotten into a lifeboat, and the lifeboat was ready to go down when she got out to go to the kennel to save what in most stories is a Great Dane. And she never made it back to the lifeboats. And whether or not it's true, again, suspect, but it is true that she is one of only 5 female first-class passengers to have died on the Titanic. Now, if one did decide to bring a dog on board, they had to pay. You basically had to buy a ticket at a lower price for your animal. There was even a 25-penny fee paid for a canary that sailed from Southampton to Cherbourg and got off at Cherbourg, surviving the Titanic. Now, whether or not you had a dog or a canary with you, if you were an early riser, you could have tea and scones brought to your stateroom, but for most, mealtime was served from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. But where you enjoyed your breakfast was very much up to you. In the first-class dining room, over 550 passengers can dine at the same time, and a feature of the room is the arrangement of the recessed bays, where family and other parties can dine together in semi-privacy. And hopefully you had thought ahead and decided where you wanted to sit before you boarded. But passengers who have not previously arranged for seats at table to be reserved should apply for same to the second steward. Children are not entitled to seats in the saloon unless full fare is paid. Now, if you wanted something a little more elite, you could take your breakfast in the a la carte restaurant on B deck. Now, meals at the a la carte restaurant were not included in the price of your ticket, breakfast costing an additional 3 shillings. But the food and experience were supposed to be exquisite, and more importantly, exclusive, because you did have to have reservations made ahead of time. As Lady Duff Gordon said, "Fancy strawberries in April, and in mid-ocean. The whole thing is positively uncanny." Why, you would think you were at the Ritz. And many passengers did refer to the a la carte restaurant as the Ritz. But if the Ritz was still a little too public for you, or if you'd simply had too much brandy in the smoking room the night before and just couldn't be bothered to drag yourself down to the dining saloon, you could take a full breakfast in your room. Or if you had one of the 2 deluxe parlor suites on B deck, like Rose from Titanic, you could dine on your own private promenade deck. One thing that made this possible aboard Titanic was the advent of these silver plate food warmers, along with hot water sleeves that would kind of go around the food trays to keep things warm, similar to those insulated bags your pizza comes in when you order delivery. And if you were dining in your room, you'd likely be ordering from the menu that we are using today. And that menu, along with all of the menus, would have been put together by the chief first-class steward, Andrew Latimer, along with the chefs on board. Now, we obviously know about the dishes that we are making today, but there are a few other things on the menu that I kind of want to point out. First, Quaker Oats and puffed rice, both of which were made by the Quaker Oats Company, an executive of which, Walter Donald Douglas, was traveling aboard Titanic. I can only assume that when he saw his company's product on the menu, he would feel obliged to order it as long as he had room after eating all of the meat that was provided on this menu. Grilled mutton, kidneys and bacon, grilled ham, sausage, sirloin steak, mutton chops, and of course, lamb collops. Slices of meat, in this case lamb, that was served with a sort of brown gravy and mushrooms very often, but there are different ways to make collops. Also, in England, the Monday before Lent is known as Collop Monday, and that's a day that everybody would eat collops, though I prefer the following day, which is Pancake Day. Thank you very much. Other breakfast options were eggs made most any way, as well as potatoes, mashed, sautéed, or jacket, that is, baked potatoes. And for bread, which there was plenty of, you could have scones, cornbread, or Vienna or graham rolls. And Vienna rolls were only called that in England. Most other places called them Kaisersemmel or Kaiser rolls, and that's because the design on them looked like the Kaiser's crown. They can be made in all sorts of ways, but the shape is really the important thing. And today, usually they're quite large, and we eat them for sandwiches or hamburgers. But most of the older recipes that I was looking at call for rather small, tight buns, like meant for breakfast. There you go. Now, graham rolls were also on the smaller side and were made of graham flour, which today is mostly just used for graham crackers. And all of these would have been baked daily aboard Titanic by the chief baker Charles Joffin and his team of bakers. And I did a whole video on him and how he survived by getting drunk and then riding the stern down, again alongside Rose from the movie. Now, to accompany the bread, you had the options of black currant conserve, basically jam, Oxford marmalade, sometimes written as marmalade, at least on the menu, and that was on the ship. It was Frank Cooper's Oxford marmalade, and you can actually still buy that today. I did. What I did not buy was the Narbonne honey. The real Narbonne honey, which is made in a specific region in southern France. It's a white honey, and it's supposed to be wonderful, but it's really, really expensive. I found it for like $70 for a little jar like that, so one day I'll get it, but not today. And while $70 for a jar of honey is a little out of my budget range right now, it'd be nothing if you were, say, worth $1 billion, like the only Spanish couple in first class, Victor Peñasco and Maria Josefa Peñasco, Pepita to her family. And while their story really has nothing to do with breakfast, other than the fact that they would have eaten it while aboard the ship, I really wanted to tell their story because I think it's fascinating, and it's definitely one of the lesser known stories from the Titanic, so please indulge me. The couple were married in December of 1910, and this was followed by a year-long honeymoon traveling around the capitals of Europe while they waited for their mansion in Madrid to be readied for them. Now, they did stay in Europe the entire time because Victor's mother, who lived in Madrid, who was footing the bill for most of the trip, told them that they could not get on a ship to cross the ocean as it was bad luck to do so on a honeymoon. But when the couple found themselves in Paris in early 1912, advertisements for Titanic were plastered all over the city. And the allure of riding on the ship of dreams, the unsinkable Titanic to New York City was just too much, and so they did book passage. But how to tell Mama? Well, they didn't. See, Maria Josefa's maid would go along with them, but Victor's butler was to stay in Paris along with a stack of pre-written postcards from Paris telling about all of the wonderful romantic adventures that they were having. Then the butler could send these periodically to Victor's mother to keep her in the dark. So with their plan in motion, they boarded Titanic at Cherbourg. Now, the couple, who spoke little to no English, were nonetheless a hit. A fellow first-class passenger wrote, "The little Spanish bride and her husband were just like little canaries. They were so loving and were having such a happy honeymoon that everyone on the Titanic became interested in them." Well, after enjoying a lavish dinner in the first-class dining saloon on the night of April 14th, the couple went back to their room to ready for bed, while Fermina, their maid, was in her cabin mending a corset. And while she was doing her needlework, she felt a slight vibration, and then the engine stopped. And so she decided to go to her employer's cabin and see if they had felt anything. People were starting to stir out in the corridor, and even though the staff told them that there was nothing to worry about, Victor, who was still dressed, decided to go up onto the boat deck just to check it out. When he went up there, he saw crew members readying the lifeboats. So he immediately went back down to his cabin and told both of the ladies to get dressed and head on up. Now, when they arrived up on deck, the band, which had been playing at their dinner just a couple hours earlier, had come out onto the boat deck to play some upbeat music to alleviate the worries of anxious passengers. And Victor tried to figure out exactly what was going on and how to get them to a lifeboat, but he didn't really know English, and so it was very confused. And frankly, even if you did know English, the entire situation was very confused. Luckily, the nearby Countess of Roths, who knew some French, was able to lead them through the crowd to Lifeboat 8. Of course, at this time, it was still very much women and children first, and so Victor knew that he could not accompany his wife into the lifeboat. So he embraced her and then, in Spanish, said, "Pepita, may you be very happy." Then he put his wife and her maid into the lifeboat with the Countess and stepped back onto the deck. And then he watched as lifeboat number 8, which was less than half full, lowered into the sea. The Countess of Roths, who took control of the tiller in the lifeboat, later wrote, "Then Senora de Satorre Peñasco began to scream for her husband. It was too horrible. I left the tiller to my cousin and slipped down beside her to be of what comfort I could. Poor woman. Her sobs tore our hearts, and her moans were unspeakable in their sadness. When the awful end came, I tried my best to keep the Spanish woman from hearing the agonizing sound of distress. They seemed to continue forever, although it could not have been more than 10 minutes until the silence of a lonely sea dropped down. The indescribable loneliness, the ghastliness of our feelings can never be told." But it was actually after the sinking that 2 more tragic events took place. First, the butler did not know of his employer's fate, and so continued to send postcards that had these fictitious stories of their wonderful life and honeymoon and romantic adventures in Paris. And he would send these to his mother. And even weeks after his mother found out that her son was dead, postcards kept coming in the mail. The second tragedy was that, according to Spanish law at the time, without a body, Victor could not be declared dead for 20 years. That would put his wife in her 40s before she could get any inheritance of hers or his, or until she could remarry. So Victor's family did what I think any of us would have done and bribed someone who was part of the effort to get the bodies out of the Atlantic. It was all happening in Canada, and they basically found a body that hadn't been identified and paid someone to let the maid go and identify that body as Victor. This allowed Maria Josefa to remarry a few years later, and her maid actually stayed with her throughout the rest of their lives pretty much, and they both lived long and happy lives. And I just love these little stories from that event. And that's why I keep returning to Titanic. All through my life I keep returning to Titanic, but that's why I'm returning to it here on the show, just for one episode right now. But if you're not sick of Titanic, then maybe I'll do it once or twice a year. A lot of food, a lot of stories from Titanic to cover. Or if there are any other topics that you want me to cover, any events that you want me to talk about, I will gladly add those to the list. But for now, it's time to make some shirred eggs. So the recipe for shirred eggs that I'm using comes from Fanny Farmer, and she says to mix some melted butter with breadcrumbs. Then line the bottom of a ramekin with a bit of the breadcrumbs. She also says you can actually scoop out a tomato and line the bottom of that with breadcrumbs. Either way, gently slip 1 or 2 broken eggs into the cup, then sprinkle with salt and pepper, cover with buttered crumbs, and bake. I put them in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for about 15 minutes, but it's gonna kind of depend on the eggs and what they're in, so you're just looking for a slight wobble. Then we add that to the rest of our breakfast, and here we are. A first-class breakfast aboard the RMS Titanic. So I'm just gonna kind of go in order of the menu, so I'm gonna start with the baked apple. Let's try it. I mean, oh my God, that's good. What is not to like? It is apple and sugar and butter and cinnamon. It's basically, it tastes like an apple pie without any crust. And now I just wish I had made like a dozen of these. That's wonderful, and I could eat that for breakfast every day. And for these smoked salmon cornets, I love smoked salmon. What's not to like? It's delicious, nice and cold. I like it when it's very cold. Yeah, fantastic. Now, unfortunately, the next thing I should eat is the shirred eggs, but I tried them right as they came out of the oven because she says to eat them right when they come out, so I figured I would try them. And it turns out my, at one time, very mild allergy to egg whites has become a not so mild allergy to egg whites, and I'm not going to put myself through that again, so I'm not gonna try it. Suffice it to say, they were creamy and kind of had a wonderful crunch from the breadcrumbs, and then my mouth swelled up, so I couldn't eat anymore. But they were fantastic. Not entirely sure how I'm going to tackle things going forward because, well, I was planning on doing deviled eggs soon, but maybe I can just eat the inside. I don't know. And it's weird because if it's like baked in a cake, it's fine, but when it's just the egg white, bad things happen. So instead, I'm going to move right to the buckwheat cakes. And traditionally, these would be served with syrup, but I want to just try it without anything just to get the flavor because they look very different than a normal pancake. They taste very different from a normal pancake. Buckwheat is such a healthy flavor, we'll say that. What I do love, though, is that little bit of sourness from the yeast that rose overnight. And so I would definitely make these with I would just use regular flour. I don't like buckwheat flour all that much. It's just such a strong flavor. It would take a lot of syrup to kind of overcome that. But I know some people that really love it, so if you love it, then make buckwheat cakes. Now I do also want to try both the black currant conserve and the vintage Oxford marmalade. And this is actually the brand that they had on the ship. This one is not, but this is the brand that they had on the ship, and you can get it still and it says vintage Oxford marmalade. They have different types. The vintage kind, it's much darker than modern marmalade tends to be. Here you can see the color, but it's very dark and it's very bitter. At first it's like really sweet, but then it becomes bitter, and it's the bitterness that stays in your mouth. And I wish it was the other way around. It was like bitter and oh, then it's pleasantly sweet. It's the other way around. So it kind of becomes a little bit of a punishment in my eyes at the end. But this, on the other hand, I mean,
I could have that on bread. 3 meals a day. Fantastic. The seeds definitely get caught in your teeth. Yeah, they're gonna be there all day now, but that was just a little bit too. But it's so good. It has this slight, what I associate with medicine, like a medicinal flavor, but in the best of possible ways. I don't mean that in a bad way at all. It's more of like, it recalls medicine, but delicious. Now at the very end of the meal, they would have some watercress. It was thought at the time, and I think it still is, to help with digestion, and it was very popular. Tastes like watercress, you know, kind of a wonderfully earthy green. I don't know how they would have had it, but I think just plain. Sometimes they would put in a salad in other recipes, but I think here it would just be plain. It's interesting. There's also like a spiciness to it. That took a second. So overall, everything was delicious, but the baked apple kind of takes the cake or the pie. For me, you should definitely make that one. Everything else, wonderful, the smoked salmon and everything, but yeah, the baked apple, definitely make that.
When it comes to the Titanic, the first and third class passengers get most of the publicity, while second class, the coach class, often gets neglected. Well, not today. Today we are talking second class lifestyle with a first class dish of sautéed chicken lyonnaise, served at the very last meal on Titanic. Thank you to Vite Ramen for sponsoring this video as we cover the second class, the forgotten class, on Titanic. This time on Tasting History. So today we're covering the second class, but the dish that we're making was served to the first class as part of the fourth dinner course on the night of the sinking. So I chose to do this dish rather than a second class dish from that last night because 1, it sounds really good, and 2, because it could have very well been served to the second class just on a different night that we don't have a menu from. Often the dishes were served to both classes on different nights. When it comes to the recipe, we must look to Auguste Escoffier. The restaurants on the Titanic were often meant to resemble those at the Ritz Hotel, where Escoffier was the head chef. And his recipe for this dish is a little bit different than its modern counterpart, which is usually coated in flour and some herbs, but he calls for a plain sautéed chicken with sauce lyonnaise. Heat 50 grams of butter in a pan, add 250 grams chopped onion, and cook slowly to a golden color. Add 2 deciliters each of white wine and vinegar, reduce by 2/3, and add 7.5 deciliters sauce demi-glace. Simmer gently, skimming as necessary for 5 to 6 minutes, and pass through a sieve. So the sauce is the star here, otherwise it's really just plain chicken. And his recipe I'm going to cut down a little bit just so it makes enough sauce for 4 chicken breasts, and they should be fairly small chicken breasts. As I said, this was part of the 4th course of 10 courses. So the dishes tended to be rather small, just a few bites of everything. But even then, after 10 courses, I would imagine one feels rather everything you'll need to make ramen. But to make chicken lyonnaise, what you'll need is 2 tablespoons or 28 grams of butter, 2 small onions, about 150 grams, chopped julienne, aka strips, a little less than a half cup or 100 milliliters of white wine, a little less than a half cup or 100 milliliters of white wine vinegar. Now this is the big difference between this version and the modern version of this sauce, the amount of vinegar that Escoffier calls for, and you would not be wrong in cutting it by like 75%. But for today, since this is the amount he calls for, that's what I'll be using. And now for the secret sauce of this sauce, you need 1.5 cups or 350 milliliters of demi-glace. Demi-glace is a rich brown sauce that is absolutely magical, but it can take up to 8 to 10 hours to make in the modern version, and if you go by Escoffier's version, it takes 48 hours to make. Luckily, you can also just buy it concentrated, and I'll put a link in the description to where you can get that. No doubt making it from scratch does taste better, but that's a lot of work, and I'm not sure that my palate could tell the difference. Now Escoffier calls for veal demi-glace, which is a much darker, rich brown. I am using chicken demi-glace, which is a little bit on the lighter side, but they're both magical. So first, heat the butter over medium heat until melted, and add the chopped onion and let them cook for about 10 minutes, occasionally stirring until they are golden brown. Try not to let them burn like mine did. Clearly my pan has some hot spots. Also, you want a nice deep pan for this. Then lower the heat a little and add the white wine and the vinegar and let it simmer until it reduces to 1/3 of the original amount. Then pour in the demi-glace and let it simmer for another 5 to 6 minutes while you prepare your chicken by seasoning it with salt and pepper. Heat a bit of vegetable oil in a skillet over medium-high heat and place the chicken in the pan and cook for about 5 minutes, then turn and cook for another 5 minutes. Like I said, this dish would have likely also been served to the second class, and unfortunately, through my research, I found that the second class is the least written about class on the ship, which frankly I find odd, seeing as most of us, at least me or I, would have been in the second class. Though the middle class was smaller in 1912, and the Titanic reflected that. There were about 329 first-class passengers, 710 third class, and only 285 second class. But if you were in the second class, this is how your voyage on Titanic might have gone down. Pun very much intended. So there were a few places where as a passenger you could have boarded the Titanic. In Southampton, England at noon on April 10th, later that same day in Cherbourg on the coast of France, or on April 11th in Queenstown, Ireland, where some of the very last photos of Titanic were taken. Interestingly, most of the photos of the Titanic, at least on board, are actually of her sister ship, the Olympic. And I'll touch more on that ship and their other sister, the Britannic, all built in Belfast, Ireland, in a future episode. But if you were in the second class on Titanic, you probably were boarding at Southampton, England. Likely, you had taken the 8:30 a.m. train from London, which was especially meant for Titanic's passengers. There were actually two trains, one for first class and one for second and third class, and they were both a little bit late, but the second and third class train didn't get to port until 11:30, only a half an hour before the ship was meant to leave. Luckily, since you weren't third class, you didn't have to go get checked for lice, rather you could just walk onto the ship on sea deck. Immediately it would hit you that the Titanic was quite a cut above most other ships of the day. They spared no expense. You'd descend a fine oak staircase to your cabin, though unlike in third class, the second class cabins were much more varied. So much so that sometimes the best second class cabins could be used for first class cabins, and the worst second class cabins could be used for third class cabins. But most were right in the middle. They were designed for 2 or 4 passengers, and if you were single, you likely shared a room with a stranger. Great way to meet people. And if you didn't need all of the bunks, some could be folded up into an upholstered sofa. Upholstered because you didn't have lice. The rooms had running water, though it wasn't hot and cold from the ship's pipes like in first class, but instead came from a tank that had to be periodically filled. Like third class, the ship's beams were often left visible, but like first class, they were furnished with fine mahogany furniture, and a few even had carpet on the floor. You also had more storage than a third class passenger, but one thing you didn't have was your own toilet or bath. Those were still shared accommodations. Now, most people at the time would have considered second class really top drawer, better than first class on most other ships. But there is always someone who's going to complain. During the Senate inquiry following the sinking, Imanita Shelley used her official affidavit as less of a discussion of the sinking and more the way that you would complain in a Yelp review. Instead of being assigned to the accommodation purchased, we were taken to a small cabin many decks down in the ship, which was so small that it could only be called a cell. It was impossible to open a regulation steamer trunk in said cabin. It was impossible for a third person to enter said cabin unless both occupants first of all crawled into their bunks. She complained in a note to the ship's purser that she was very ill, and owing to the freezing cold of the cabin, was in great danger. And if the purser refused to act, she, Mrs. Shelley, would appeal to the captain. I would like to speak to the manager of the Titanic, thank you very much. And sadly, after working in restaurants for many years, I have realized that complaining actually works, and it worked for her. She and her mother were upgraded to a better cabin, but even then, she said this cabin, though large and roomy, was not furnished in the comfortable manner as the same accommodation procured on the Cunard or other lines. Then she went on to complain about the food, the toilets, and even the temperature of the air outside, though they were too far north for the season and there were icebergs about, and so maybe she had a point there. Though she also complained about being uncomfortable in the lifeboat, which included, and I quote, a crazed Italian. But Mrs. Shelley was definitely in the minority because most second-class passengers seemed overwhelmingly happy with their cabins and with things like the fact that they had a barber shop on board and a library decorated in the 18th century Adams style where you could borrow a book or sit at one of the writing desks in a plush green upholstered chair and write a letter home that could be posted from the Titanic, as she was a Royal Mail ship. You could often do this while listening to the string quintet that played 3 times a day outside of the library. The second class also had some of the best promenade space on the ship. There were long covered spaces with deck chairs on B and C deck, but if you really wanted to feel the wind in your hair, then head on up to the aft boat deck. You could lounge in the shadow of the 4th funnel, which wouldn't even have any smoke coming out of it, because that funnel was actually pretty much non-functioning as a smokestack, but rather there for decoration and to help ventilate the lower decks. You would also have a great view of the stern, but it would have been harder to look off the side of the ship due to lifeboats being there. The first class had a lot more space on the boat deck that was unencumbered by those pesky lifeboats, though the original design would have had lifeboats there as well, 48 in all, enough for everyone on board. But J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, believed the deck would look too cluttered, and so dropped the number of lifeboats to 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsible lifeboats, making it all the worse that he made sure he was on one of those lifeboats when the ship went down. What's crazy is that even those 20 lifeboats were more than were required by law, and that was because the law was rather outdated and was written not dependent on how many people were aboard, but the tonnage of the ship. And since it hadn't been updated in years, it maxed out at 10,000 tons. But the Titanic was 46,000 tons. Now, when it comes to second class food, again, it's really a first class experience. In fact, both classes' food was made in the same galley or kitchen and featured many of the same dishes. The biggest difference was simply the choice and quantity of those dishes. Instead of multiple restaurants, second class only had one. It spanned the width of D deck, letting in lots of natural light from portholes on either side, and it could accommodate 394 passengers. It was well lit with lamps in the ceiling and had a piano to provide music during meals. In fact, it was also kind of music that called you to your meal. While third class was called to meals with a bell and first with a bugle, second class enjoyed the dulcet tone of a gong. You'd sit at large communal tables in mahogany and crimson leather swivel chairs that were bolted to the ground. But it was not open seating. Everyone was assigned a different seat, so you better hope that you're not sitting next to a loud chewer, because you might not be able to move. And while the meals aren't as decadent as first class, they are a lot more robust than third. An 8 a.m. breakfast included oats and hominy, fresh fish, and Yarmouth bloaters. That's a smoked and salted fish with a very unappetizing name. Ox kidneys and bacon, ham, eggs and potatoes, scones and buckwheat pancakes with syrup. Take away the kidneys and bloaters and I'm on board. Now in third class, the big meal of day was dinner that was served at noon, but in second, they had a smaller luncheon, saving room for the evening dinner. This started with a consommé tapioca, then baked haddock with sharp sauce, then you had a choice of entree of curried chicken, spring lamb with mint sauce, or roast turkey with cranberry sauce. I love Thanksgiving all year round. There were sides of peas, turnips, rice, and potatoes, and then desserts of plum pudding, wine jelly, a coconut sandwich, and American ice cream. The first class enjoyed French ice cream, which tends to be a little bit creamier and is made with eggs, though in my house, American or French ice cream are perfectly welcome. The meal ended with cheese, fruit, coffee, and nuts assorted. This traditional setup of a meal is where the phrase "from soup to nuts" came from. In fact, second-class passenger Kate Buss recalled, "On the night of the wreck, our tables were a picture. The huge bunches of grapes which topped the fruit basket on every table were thrilling. The menus were wonderfully varied and tempting. I stayed at table from soup to nuts." Though another passenger, Charlotte Collier, thought it was too heavy and rich, but admitted that no effort had been spared to give even the second cabin passengers on that Sunday the best dinner that money could buy. After dinner, the men often adjourned to the second-class smokeroom, decorated in the Louis XVI style with chairs of dark green Moroccan leather and patterned linoleum tiles, and of course featured a well-stocked bar. Benjamin Hart was actually playing cards there on the night of the sinking and didn't get to his room until 11:30. His wife Esther was also awake when he got there, but she wasn't getting ready for bed because she spent most of the day sleeping and stayed up all night watching. See, she had been anxious ever since her husband told her that they were sailing on the Titanic, because she felt that the ship's reputation for being unsinkable was flying in the face of the Almighty, and she didn't believe that the ship would even make it through her maiden voyage. Her husband probably mocked her, but only 10 minutes after he got to his room, the entire room shook. Another second-class passenger, Lawrence Beasley, also felt the jolt but didn't think anything of it. A moment later, when the engine stopped, he did decide to get up and go out just to see what had happened. He saw some men playing cards in the smoke room and asked what was going on, and they said that they had grazed an iceberg that they had seen pass by the window just a moment before. Now you'd think that this would be cause for alarm, but it wasn't. They went back to their cards, and Lawrence went back to his cabin. A while later, he heard people going upstairs, and so once again he decided to leave his room and went outside and noticed that the ship was listing forward ever so slightly. He thought that maybe a few compartments had flooded in the front, but Titanic was made for that, so everything would be okay. And again, he went back to his cabin. Then he heard a crew member calling for all of the passengers to come out onto the deck with their life belts. And so he put on some warmer clothes and his life belt and went up out on deck. But again, he thought it was just a precaution and said that everything was calm and nobody was panicking. And then they saw crew members uncovering the lifeboats. Men were told to stand back while the women and children got into the boats, though they were slow to do so, feeling that the boats were less safe than staying on the ship. And so Lawrence stood and watched several boats lower half full. Still no panic. Then when lifeboat 13 was ready to go down, again not entirely full, a crew member looked around and called for more ladies and nobody came, so he told Lawrence, "You better get in," which he did. But as the boat lowered down, they realized they couldn't find the pin to release the boat from the ropes. And it turned out that the Titanic was pumping water out of the side of the ship, which formed a stream that pushed their lifeboat right beneath lifeboat 15 as it lowered. It very nearly crushed them and would have had someone not had a knife and cut through their pulley ropes so they could push away from the ship at the very last moment. Then they rode out into the darkness, and it was dark. It was a moonless night, and the only light was from some stars and, of course, the ship itself. Also, there was no wind, so the water was perfectly calm. He said that from a distance, everything on the ship looked normal, except that he did notice that the water was now covering the bottom row of portholes. Then at 2 a.m., things took a turn. She slowly tilted straight on end with the stern vertically upwards. As she did so, the lights in the cabins and the saloons flashed once more and then went out altogether. At the same time, the machinery roared down through the vessel with a groaning rattle that would have been heard for miles. It was not yet quite the end. To our amazement, she remained in the upright position for a time, which I estimate as 5 minutes. It was certainly for some minutes that we watched at least 150 feet of the Titanic towering up above the level of the sea, looming black against the sky. Then, with a quiet, slanting dive, she disappeared beneath the waters. Then there fell on our ears the most appalling noise that human being ever heard. The cries of hundreds of our fellow beings struggling in the icy water, crying for help with a cry that we knew could not be answered. We longed to return to pick up some of those who were swimming, but this would have meant the swamping of our boat and the loss of all of us. His is one of the best accounts of what the people in the lifeboats saw as the Titanic finally sank. And second class did fare far better than third, but even then 166 were lost and only 119 survived. And among the survivors was the worrying night owl Esther Hart and her daughter Eva, who later credited their survival to her mother's refusal to sleep at night. Unfortunately, Esther's husband, Benjamin, could not get into one of the lifeboats, and he died in the disaster. Now we will be getting to the first class stories, which in many ways are the most interesting. But first, we're going to cover the crew. Often in books, they are just as neglected as the second class. But without them, the ship wouldn't have moved, everything would have been dirty, and there would have been nobody to make some chicken lyonnaise. So once the sauce is ready, pour it through a sieve, and then pour that onto the chicken, and then garnish with a bit of the onion. And here we are, sautéed chicken lyonnaise from the last meal on the Titanic. That's so good. That is so complex. You get the onions, but it's not oniony at all. It's more just dark with a gentle sweetness. A lot of times today they end up putting tomato paste or even sugar in it to make it sweeter. It doesn't need that. It's so wonderful, and the vinegar is a little sharp. I would probably cut the vinegar in half at least. But it's not bad. It's just, it almost overpowers some of the other flavors that I want to be tasting. I do think that a demi-glace made with veal would be even better, just warmer, but this is kind of nice and light, and you still get the chicken flavor. It's not overpowering. It's fantastic. So more Titanic ahead. Make sure to like this video, follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Everything about the first-class experience aboard the RMS Titanic was extravagant and elegant. But perhaps nothing was more extravagant and elegant than dinner in the first-class dining saloon, which culminated in this peaches in chartreuse jelly, something I'm going to make today. So we started our month of Titanic videos with a soup from third class, then made several entrees, a cocktail, and a palate cleanser. So now it's time for dessert. And while that first-class dinner menu from the night of April 14th, 1912 had several dessert options, none seems more interesting and frankly foreign than the peaches in chartreuse jelly. But what is peaches in chartreuse jelly? Well, most modern interpretations assume that it is peaches inside of a chartreuse-flavored jelly. And this is chartreuse. It is a liqueur that was very popular at the time, dates back a long time. It actually has a wonderful history. I'll have to do a whole episode on it at some point, but it has a very, very herbal flavor. It kind of reminds me of medicine, actually. Sweet medicine. But when you go back to actual cookbooks from this era, you see that chartreuse jelly sometimes referred to the liqueur, but more often just referred to the color. Color with a few drops of sap green to make it a pale tint like green chartreuse, and flavor it with chartreuse, noyau, brandy, or other flavor. So yes, they were still using the ingredient, but not always. And the great Victorian cookbook author Isabella Beeton includes several recipes for chartreuse with bananas and chartreuse with oranges, and has a picture of chartreuse with peaches, though not a recipe, and it's not in color, which is kind of annoying, but none of those recipes do include chartreuse. So this version is going to take a little bit from Agnes Marshall, a little bit from Isabella Beeton, and a little bit from Escoffier, who said, when using peaches in jelly, they should be dipped into boiling water so as to remove the skin. They are then cooked in a syrup and allowed to cool in it. Now today we wouldn't usually think of peaches in jello as a particularly fancy dessert, but it would have been the show-stopping centerpiece of any fancy dinner during the Gilded Age. I came across a fact that made me wonder if the stationary bikes aboard the Titanic didn't cause somewhat of a fervor. Because only 20 years earlier, it was thought that women riding bicycles would lead to immorality. For it is not the proper thing for the ladies to ride the bicycle. They wear skirts, of course, but if we do not stop them now, they will want to be in the style with the New York women and wear bloomers. Then how would our schoolrooms look with the lady teachers parading around among the boys and girls wearing bloomers? Well, land sakes, where are my smelling salts? Now, if you want to be scandalized with more interesting facts like this, you can click the link in the description to visit wondrium.com/tastinghistory to start your free trial today. But whether you're wearing a skirt or bloomers or even trousers, what you'll need for this recipe is 16 sheets of gelatin or 4 envelopes of powdered gelatin. Now, by the time of Titanic, both types of gelatin were used, so you can use either one. They were usually either made of beef hooves or isinglass, which is made from the swim bladders of fish. So yeah, either one's gonna work, but don't think about what they are. 3 cups or 750 milliliters of water, a half cup or 50 grams of sugar, 1 cup or 250 milliliters of chartreuse, 2 to 4 peaches, and a cup of simple syrup, or if you don't have ripe peaches, then you can use canned peaches in syrup. And when it came to the Titanic, I was wondering what they had, because the Titanic was sailing in April and peaches really aren't in season in April, but they did have plenty of canned foods on the ship. And I didn't see peaches on the manifest, though I don't have a complete manifest. But then I came across a quote from first-class passenger Mrs. Douglas, who recalled, "The food was superb: caviar, lobster, quail from Egypt, plover's eggs, and hothouse grapes and fresh peaches." So not only did they have fresh peaches, but they also had grapes. And in 1912, eating a grape was much more complicated than it is now. First of all, they had seeds. And second of all, they put them out on the table in front of you, you can't just take them. No, you would have a pair of grape scissors, specially designed for cutting a small bunch from a larger bunch that then you could put on your plate and then eat with your fingers, but there would still be rules. When eating grapes, the half-closed hand should be placed to the lips, and the stones and skins adroitly allowed to fall into the fingers and quickly placed on the side of the plate, the back of the hand concealing the maneuver from view. That really sounds like a very stressful fruit to eat. Luckily, this recipe doesn't have any grapes, it has peaches, and it's not that hard to make. So first mix the 3 cups of water with the sugar in a large saucepan and bring to a simmer. While it heats, soak the gelatin leaves or bloom the packets in cold water, then remove the simmering water from the heat and squeeze out any excess water from the gelatin and add it to the hot water. Then mix until it dissolves. Also, make sure that you never boil the water with the gelatin in it, because boiling it will make it lose its gelatinous properties. Then mix in the chartreuse and pour it into a well-greased mold. Now, if you have a wonderful period Victorian mold like this, then use that, but if you don't, then you can use either a silicone or a metal bundt pan. Either way, you're going to set it in the refrigerator for about 1 to 3 hours. It's going to depend on the size and the width of your pan. You'd want it to be starting to set where it's kind of thick, but not too thick, because you want to be able to fit the fruit in. Now, if you're using canned peaches, you don't really have to do anything here, but if you are using fresh peaches, score a small X in the bottom, and then set it into a pot of boiling water for about 30 to 45 seconds, and then take it out and immediately put it in ice water for 10 to 15 seconds. Now, the skins should just slough off very easily, but if they're not actually ripe, it's gonna be a little bit harder. You can try doing it again, but even then, you may have to peel them by hand. But frankly, if you don't have ripe peaches, like I couldn't find ripe peaches, then maybe canned peaches is just the way to go. But if they are ripe, then heat some simple syrup on the stove, slice the peaches, and coat the slices in the simple syrup. Then turn off the stove and leave them to cool. Regardless of which peach you use, once the jelly is thickened, insert the peaches into the jelly in whatever style you like, and then return it to the refrigerator for at least 8 hours. Though if you have a thick mold like this, fairly deep, it really is going to take closer to a full day to set. But that's plenty of time to like and subscribe, follow me on Twitter at TastingHistory1, and imagine yourself a first-class passenger aboard the RMS Titanic. Now, the disparity between first, second, and third class passengers is pretty evident. What's less evident is the disparity within the first class, which is actually a lot more than it is between the other classes. See, the cost of a first class ticket could vary wildly, the cheapest being around £30 or $3,500 today, and the most expensive around £870 or close to $100,000 today. So when we talk about first class, yes, some of those people are like first class passengers on an airplane, but then some of those people are more like people who own their own private jets. But even at the bottom of first class, your cabin is quite nice. Besides a bed, there was a horsehair sofa, dressing table, wardrobe, and a marble-topped washstand with basin. Now, while the entire ship was centrally heated, the first class cabins included other personal electric heaters, and you had a little call button that you could call a steward in, really for anything, but you could ask them to bring a personal electric heater for your bed. When I worked on a cruise ship, we weren't even allowed to have hot plates. Times have changed. But at this low degree of first class, you were still missing something that we would consider pretty standard today, and that was your own bath or toilet. For that, you needed to upgrade to a suite. Now, at this level of wealth, it was assumed that you were traveling with help, and so you would have an adjoining room for your servants. They were also generally a little bit larger and had larger beds than the other cabins, but if you wanted real space, then you had to splurge on one of the 4 parlor suites. 2 large bedrooms, each with a walk-in dressing room, a private bathroom and lavatory, and a spacious sitting room where you could host small parties. These rooms featured plush sofas and chairs, a writing table, and a faux fireplace. 2 of them even included a private 50-foot promenade deck, just in case you couldn't even be bothered to walk near other people. On the maiden voyage, one of the suites was occupied by the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, and the other by Mrs. Charlotte Cardezza, her son Thomas, and their 2 servants. And Mrs. Cardezza, sometimes written Cardoza, did not pack light, but rather packed like my mom going on a long weekend. She had 14 steamer trunks, 3 suitcases, 3 large crates of baggage, and a medicine chest. But most first-class passengers had people to do their unpacking for them, and so they could enjoy the amenities Titanic had to offer. You could head up to the boat deck for an open-air promenade with views to the side of the ship as well as toward the bow. Walk around to the starboard side of the boat deck and you'd find the gymnasium with state-of-the-art equipment like the electric horse, the electric camel, a rowing machine, and mechanical bicycles. For something a bit more aerobic, you could spend 2 shillings to play a game of squash on the indoor squash court, or swim a few laps in the saltwater swimming bath open to women before lunch and men afterward. This amenity was part of the Turkish bath complex, the precursor to today's spa. For 4 shillings, you could be pampered in a set of rooms designed to evoke a Turkish hammam. It evoked, in the words of the White Star Line, something of the grandeur of the mysterious East. Can't imagine seeing that on a marketing pamphlet today. You could also have a shave at the barbershop or enjoy a cigar in the first-class smoking room, as long as you're a man, that is. The ladies preferred to lax in the reading and writing room, decorated in the Georgian style with silk-upholstered settees, or else in the first-class lounge with high ceilings modeled after the Palace of Versailles, and was primarily used for playing cards, reading, and enjoying a bit of coffee and tea. But as nice as these activities were, they were merely diversions between what took up most of your time, and that was eating meals. If you were an early riser, you'd likely start eating in your room, where the steward would bring you fresh fruit, warm scones and jam, and coffee and tea. And then you would dress for second breakfast. Yes, like hobbits, at 8 a.m., the first-class passengers would be called to breakfast by the bugle player. Breakfast included omelets, baked apples, steak and mutton chops to order, vegetable stew, and different smoked fish, and a selection of carbs, which included Quaker oats. Likely enjoyed by first-class passenger Walter Donald Douglas, who was the director of the Quaker Oats Company. Now, while there were many places for the first class to eat, this version of breakfast would have been taken in the first-class dining saloon, which could seat up to 554 passengers. Its white-paneled walls stretched the entire width of the ship, and its portholes were elegantly concealed by leaded glass windows. Now, on Sunday, April 14th, breakfast had to be cleared away for the 10:30 Anglican church service led by Captain Smith himself, after which everything had to be put back for lunch at 1 p.m. Now, after lunch, yes, you could do some exercise at the gymnasium or the promenade deck, but if I had my druthers, I'd head to the trendy Café Parisien on B deck, where many of the younger passengers gathered. Though I don't think I'd be considered a younger passenger at this point, which is kind of depressing. Other options were the Palm Court or Veranda Cafe. Matching rooms on either side of the ship, they included potted palms and ivy-covered walls to mirror the dining room of London's Savoy Hotel. Now, all of these different places to eat really illustrates one of the main differences between the first and second, and especially the third class, because second and third class had their dining saloon, and that was the only place they had to eat. First class had lots of options for all of their meals, especially for dinner. And leading up to this largest meal of the day, you would head back to your cabin to dress to the nines, as they say. Men wore white tie, and first-class passenger Elmer Taylor recalled dinner gave women passengers an opportunity to get out their latest Parisian gowns, their most brilliant jewels. It was a brilliant assembly. Contentment and happiness prevailed. Once dressed, you could take the first-class elevators down, or, more conspicuously, descend the grand staircase onto D-deck and head to the reception room to gather for dinner. This was a time to listen to Wagner and Offenbach played by the 5-piece orchestra led by Wallace Hartley. And you could order a cocktail to warm up your stomach for the 10 or 11-course onslaught you were about to enjoy. Most of this meal was served by stewards carrying around silver platters offering diners something from each dish along with an accompanying wine. They would start with oysters and hors d'oeuvres, then a choice of consommé Olga or cream of barley soup, before moving on to poached salmon with mousseline sauce, then filet mignon and chicken lyonnaise, then lamb, roast duckling, and sirloin of beef with chateau potatoes. A course of punch romaine to cleanse the palate before enjoying roast squab, asparagus, and pâté foie gras, and then a dessert of French ice cream, Waldorf pudding, eclairs, or of course some peaches in chartreuse jelly. Then there would be a course of nuts, cheese, and coffee before the men headed off to enjoy a cigar and brandy in the smoke room. Some of the ladies would withdraw to the reading room, but in practice it seems that most of the ladies stayed at the table to chat in the saloon. Though according to some sources, many of the Titanic's most elite enjoyed that final meal in the a la carte restaurant, sometimes nicknamed the Ritz restaurant. And I discussed it in detail in the last episode, but this is where Mrs. Walter Douglas ate her fresh peaches and grapes that last night on the ship. We dined the last night in the Ritz restaurant. It was the last word in luxury. The tables were gay with pink roses and white daisies, the women in their beautiful shimmering gowns of satin and silk, the men immaculate and well-groomed, the stringed orchestra playing music from Puccini and Tchaikovsky. This may have also been where Lady Duff Gordon and Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon ate as well. Lady Duff Gordon was a wealthy fashionista of the time, and she gives one of the most complete first-hand accounts of the events aboard Titanic. And it's perfect to share for this episode because it is just so first class, and I don't necessarily mean that as a compliment. She begins the narrative of that night by reassuring readers that I have never been a psychic woman and in all my life have never been to a seance or dabbled in the occult. But something warned me, some deep instinct, that all was not well. But despite her misgivings, she dresses and goes down to dinner. I remember that last meal on Titanic very well. We had a big vase of beautiful daffodils on the table, which were as fresh as if they had just been picked. Everybody was very gay, and at neighboring tables, people were making bets on the probable time of this record-breaking run. She talks of the multi-millionaires, the Wideners and Thayers, laughing as they dined with Captain Smith, and at another table was the wealthiest man on board, John Jacob Astor IV and his bride. And they were the subject of quite a bit of gossip. See, Astor was 46 and recently divorced when he married Madeline, his new bride of 18. El scandalo. But the fervor must have subsided because they were dining with former congressman and owner of Macy's department store Isidore Straus and his wife. Lady Duff Gordon says that these two so openly adored one another. They told us laughingly that in their long years of married life, they had never been separated for one day or night. Their bodies were found afterwards clasped in one another's arms. After dinner, Lady Duff Gordon returned to her cabin on A deck and chatted with her secretary, Miss Francatelli, as they warmed themselves by the electric heater. Then she undressed and went to bed. But she hadn't been asleep for very long when she was awakened by a low rumbling noise, and then she heard voices out in the hall, one that said that they had struck an iceberg. So she got up and went out into the hall, where an officer told her that it was nothing and that she should go back to bed. It was also around this time that Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, also came out of her cabin. On emerging from my stateroom, I found many men in the gangway in their pajamas. They, while standing, were chaffing each other. One of them remarked, "Are you prepared to swim in those things?" referring to the pajamas. Women were standing along the corridors in their kimonos. All seemed to be quietly listening, thinking nothing serious had occurred. By the way, in the Broadway musical Titanic, there's this wonderful song called Dressed in Your Pajamas in the Grand Salon, and it really talks about this whole scene of just everyone kind of standing around in their pajamas, not thinking that anything was wrong. But in reality, Lady Duff Gordon remembered her feeling of uneasiness and decided to wake her husband, Cosmo, and tell him to go investigate further. But 10 minutes later, he returned and told his wife that she had better put on her warmest clothes. At the same time, Miss Francatelli, her secretary, who was staying further below decks, came up and said that there was water in her room and that they better put on their life belts. A steward came to help them. We followed him out of the cabin. Before the door closed, I looked round it for one last time. I shall never forget that glimpse of the lovely little room with its beautiful lace quilt and pink cushion. It all looked so homely and pretty that it did not seem possible there could be any danger. At that moment, a vase of flowers on the washstand slid off suddenly and fell with a crash to the floor. When they got up on deck, the lifeboats were already being loaded, and she comments rather snidely about the willingness of the American women to enter the lifeboats without their husbands, saying that they have brought the cult of chivalry to such a pitch in the States that it comes as second nature to their men to sacrifice themselves and to the women to let them do it. She did indeed refuse to get into a lifeboat without her husband, but there was a smaller lifeboat, Lifeboat 1, that was only capable of holding about 40 people, and there was nobody else around, so she, her husband, and Miss Francatelli all got in. It lowered with only 12 people, 5 passengers and 7 crew members. It really was the closest thing you could get to a first-class experience on a lifeboat. And Lady Duff Gordon refused to look at the boat as she was sinking until her husband said, "My God, she is going now." She finally looked up and says that she could hear the clamor of everything that hadn't been bolted to the decks sliding down into the water. I think that it was only at that moment that many of those poor souls on board realized their fate. For a few seconds, Titanic stayed motionless, while agonized cries from her decks grew in intensity, and then, with one downward rush, she plunged to her grave, and the air was rent with those awful shrieks. Then silence. Now what happened next is up for some debate. What definitely did not happen was they did not go back to try to rescue anyone. But the rumor spread that Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon had actually paid the crew members on the lifeboat to not go back and rescue anyone, and the newspapers dubbed it the Money Boat. But this probably didn't actually happen. What likely happened is they were justly worried about the boat being swamped, and the rumor came from a later exchange between Sir Cosmo and one of the crew members. See, after the ship went down, Lady Duff Gordon looked at Miss Francatelli and made a feeble joke. "Just fancy that. There is your beautiful nightdress, gone." Well, that gallows humor was not appreciated by the crew members in the boat, one of whom said, "You people need not bother about losing your things, for you can afford to buy new ones when you get ashore. What about us poor fellows?" To which Sir Cosmo said, "Yes, that's hard luck if you like, but don't worry, you'll get another ship. At any rate, I'll give you a $5 each toward getting a new kit." And that's what I meant by her narrative just being so first class. And whether it was their wealth or position in society, or merely their position on the ship being closer to the lifeboats, the first class fared far better than anyone else on the ship. About 60% of them survived. And some of those survivors carried their menus with them in their coat pockets, so that today we can get a glimpse into those last happy moments aboard Titanic where they enjoyed food such as peaches in chartreuse jelly. So once your jelly is fully set, dip the mold into some hot water for just a few seconds, then set an oiled plate over the top and flip it over. It should just plop out. If it doesn't, return it to the hot water and try again. Then you can garnish it with a bit of whipped cream or Italian meringue, or just leave it as is. And here we are, peaches in chartreuse jelly from the last meal aboard the Titanic. Got some peach, got some meringue, and got some jelly, which is so jiggly. Here we go. That texture. I don't like jelly, like Jell-O. So that's the first thing. I don't like the texture. But I kind of knew that going in. What's interesting is that at first I was like, oh, this flavor, I don't want my dessert to taste like the 150 herbs that are used in chartreuse. But then there's enough sugar in there, and the peach, it kind of like coats that weird medicinal flavor. But you get the medicinal flavor at first, but then it goes away for a bit more of a subtle sweetness. Do I like it? No, I don't. But I don't hate it as much as I thought I would, so that's good. Honestly, this dish is a centerpiece, you know, but that's really all that it is, in my opinion, because I don't like jelly. So that, you know, don't let that influence if you want to make it. It's kind of fun to make, especially if you have a really cool mold. So as we wind down Titanic month, I just wanted to thank you all. These videos have done very well, and I was worried that an entire month of Titanic was going to be too much for people, but it wasn't. People really loved it, and lots of new subscribers. I hope you stick with me for future episodes, not on Titanic, because we do other interesting things here on the channel. Also, I finally finished my Titanic Lego, except that I am missing a flag that I'm pretty sure that the cat ate. Anyway, make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I'll put all the links to my socials and Patreon down in the description, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Welcome to Titanic month. Yes, not one episode, but an entire month of episodes dedicated to the food and experiences aboard the RMS Titanic. We're starting with the third class experience with this recipe for rice soup, served as the first course for dinner on the day of the disaster. Then we'll work our way through second class, the crew, and of course, first class. And there are so many stories that I've found, and I want to share as many as I can, so we'll also probably throw in a couple mini episodes in addition to our normal Tuesday episodes. Titanic month starts now, this time on Tasting History. So I have two major goals with this series. First is to finish my Lego Titanic and find a place to put it. The second is that by the end of the series, we will have created an entire meal of several different courses inspired by the menus from April 14th, 1912, the last full day that the Titanic sailed 110 years ago. And most of the dishes are going to be from the first class because they were just more exciting, but since today we're talking third class, I figured we would start off with the soup served to third class passengers for dinner on that day. Now the problem is that while we know the names of a lot of the dishes that were served on the ship, we don't have any recipes, so we don't exactly know what they were making. So I'll have to refer to period cookbooks to figure out what the recipes might have been. Like this recipe for rice soup from Eliza Acton's Modern Cookery for Private Families. Throw 4 ounces of well-washed rice into boiling water, and in 5 minutes after, pour it into a sieve, drain it well, and put it into a couple of quarts of good white boiling stock. Let it stew until tender, season the soup with salt, cayenne, and pounded mace, stir to it 3/4 of a pint of very rich cream, give it one boil, and serve it quickly. So while this may seem kind of basic, it's actually a lot more exciting than the other period rice soup recipes that I found, all of which were just rice and stock, and that's basically just rice. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 2/3 cup or 105 grams of long grain rice, 2 quarts or 2 liters of chicken or veal stock, a large pinch of salt, a 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne pepper, a 1/4 teaspoon of mace, and a little bit less than 1 cup or about 225 milliliters of cream. So first, rinse your rice. Then she says to throw it into boiling water, but because I didn't want first-degree burns, I went ahead and placed mine into boiling water. Let it boil for 5 minutes and then pour it into a sieve. Then bring the stock to a boil and put the rice into that. Then turn the heat down until it's just simmering and let it simmer for about 45 minutes. Now you're going to want to keep an eye on the soup as it boils because it can all pretty much boil away and then you'll just have rice. So make sure to keep an eye on it, and if it does look to be getting too low, then just put the lid on. But while it finishes simmering, let us take a gander at the third class experience on the Titanic. Now, I don't care what class you were, whether you were fresh off the farm or dined nightly at the Ritz. In 1912, the RMS Titanic would have been a spectacular sight. By the way, RMS stands for Royal Mail Ship, and the Titanic did carry mail. But at nearly 900 feet long, the biggest ship of its day, it carried a lot more than just mail. 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 25,000 pounds of poultry, 11,000 pounds of fresh fish, 7,000 heads of lettuce, 40 tons of potatoes, 36,000 oranges, and 13,000 grapefruit, which is about 13,000 too many in my opinion. 250 barrels of flour, 800 pounds of tea, 40,000 fresh eggs, and 1,200 quarts of ice cream. 15,000 bottles of ale, 1,000 bottles of wine, and 850 bottles of liquor. Now this huge quantity of food and drink was necessary because the ship could carry up to 3,547 passengers and crew. Though on its maiden voyage, there were only about 2,200 people, 709 of whom were third-class passengers. Now if you were one of these third-class passengers, then your ticket on average would cost about £7, which would be about $1,000 today, which doesn't sound like too much for a transatlantic crossing, but at the time, that was about 2 months' wages for the average third-class passenger. But you got a lot for your money. In my view, nothing approaching the accommodation has been experienced in any of the previous journeys, and nothing but a pleasant voyage is anticipated. Though before you board, you need to undergo a physical examination from the ship's surgeon, Dr. William Francis Norman O'Loughlin, and his team. This was because for the vast majority of third-class passengers, this was meant to be a one-way ticket to America, where then they would start a new life. And American immigration required them to go through this examination before boarding. These regulations were also why the third-class passengers were not able to gain access to much of the ship. They were meant to be kept separate from the first and second class passengers, and sometimes this was done with gates that were occasionally locked. Though these gates were not locked on the night of the sinking in an effort to keep the third class down. It just happened that they were often locked. Now, once you were on board, you'd probably head straight to your cabin, and for third-class passengers, you had two options. You may stay in one of the 84 two-berth cabins, which included electricity, a wardrobe, and even a sink with running water. Or there were also larger cabins with up to 6 bunks, and these were meant for either large families or more often for single travelers of the same sex. Now, this was quite luxurious compared to other ships of the day, but it is still third class, so their placement on the ship wasn't the best. They were usually either at the back or the stern, or the very front of the ship, or the bow. And those are not the best places on the ship because those are the places where you feel the most movement and vibration from the ship. When I worked on a cruise ship, my cabin was pretty much all the way at the bow, and I can tell you, you better like the feeling of being rocked to sleep at night. There were also 2 baths for third class, just 2. Most people washed in their room, just in their basin, but if you wanted to take a bath, they did have 2 of them, one for men and one for women, and I can venture a guess which one had the longer line. Now, even though you're barred from most of the ship, the parts that you do have access to are really quite nice. For a bit of entertainment, you can go to the general room. It is paneled and framed in pine and finished enamel white with furniture of teak. This will be the general rendezvous of the third-class passengers, men, women, and children, and will doubtless prove one of the liveliest rooms on the ship. The new field of endeavor is looked forward to with hope and confidence. The interval between the old life and the new is spent under the happiest possible conditions. Well, the happiest possible conditions were probably a few decks up in first class, but even so, it was very nice. The room had a piano, and it was a place where passengers often gathered with their own instruments to play live music and hold dances. Now, if you wanted a little peace and quiet, and you were a man, then you could go relax in the third-class smoking room. With linoleum floors, oak-paneled walls, and a bar that served ale and beer, it was a cozy place to smoke and play cards. The chairs were designed to be more comfortable, but just like in the general room, they would have been made of wood and not upholstered. And this was because, despite your checkup with the surgeon, it was just assumed that all third-class passengers had lice. Now, if you wanted a bit of fresh air, you had a few places on board where you could go feel the ocean breeze. There were several spots to promenade, but the main third-class area was at the back of the ship on the poop deck. It isn't funny, it's French. Poop deck comes from the French word la poupe, which referred to the stern of the ship. Originally, it was an elevated level at the back of an old ship, and it was there to protect the stern from being swamped by large waves. But as ships got larger and didn't worry about big waves, the poop deck lost its real necessity, and it made it so that the Titanic was actually the last ship to be made with a true poop deck. So you've got your accommodations, your place to relax, but as anyone who's ever been on a cruise knows, the most important thing is the food. And on the Titanic, the third class got food, which seems like a no-duh kind of statement, but not long before, that wasn't always the case. Many times, the third class had to bring not only all of their own food, but their own cutlery as well. But not on the Titanic. On the Titanic, even the third class food was first class. We had a grand time on the Titanic. We got very good diet and had a very jolly time dancing and singing. We had every kind of instrument on board to amuse us. Where you ate was in one of 2 dining rooms on F deck, which was separated by the watertight bulkhead. The 2 saloons extending from ship's side to ship's side, well lighted with side lights, and all finished enamel white. The chairs are of special design. The position of this apartment, i.e. in the center of the ship, illustrates the wonderful strides made in passenger comfort in modern times. Together, the rooms could accommodate 473 people, so you'd be assigned one of 2 seatings. As you entered, you'd likely hang up your coat and hat on hooks along the wall, which were decorated with posters of the White Star Line's ships and ports of call. Then you'd sit at communal tables of about 20, which were lined in linen, and you would be served by a steward. Your food coming in on white china featuring the White Star Line logo. And you'd know what your options were ahead of time because every day the menu was printed on a card in German, English, Finnish, and Swedish. And there were 4 meals a day: breakfast, dinner, tea, and supper. On Titanic's final day, breakfast consisted of, among other things, oatmeal porridge and milk, smoked herrings, jacket potatoes, ham and eggs, and plenty of fresh bread, butter, and marmalade with tea and coffee. Dinner, being the main meal of the day in third class and served around noon, would have started off with the rice soup that we're making today. After that, you'd have roast beef and brown gravy, sweet corn, boiled potatoes, and plum pudding with sweet sauce and fruit. For tea, it was cold meat, cheese, pickles, bread and butter, stewed figs, and rice. And while pretty much everyone had an afternoon meal called tea at the time, the way that this tea happened was very different depending on your place in society. In 1914, a book called The Whole Art of Dining contemptuously described this version of tea. The tea of the English working class is the most eccentric of meals, and one of the greatest injuries a gourmet can possibly conceive. This incongruous kind of food may no doubt be quite nice and tasty for this class of people, but it must shock anyone endowed with refined Epicurean instinct. Well, I think it sounds just lovely. Less lovely sounding was supper, which consisted of gruel, cabin biscuits, and cheese. Now, gruel gets a bad rap, and one of these days I'll do an entire episode on gruel, but in this case, it was probably similar to oatmeal that you made just using way too much water. And the cabin biscuits were a fancier version of hardtack. In the lifeboats, they had a less fancy version of hardtack called Spiller's and Baker's Pilot Biscuits. So the meals were simple, but they were filling, and they were probably a lot better than most of what the third class was accustomed to. And White Star Line even made an allowance for kosher meat supplied and cooked for Jewish passengers as desired. And any complaint respecting the food supplied, want of attention, or incivility should be at once reported to the purser or chief steward. For purposes of identification, each steward wears a numbered badge on the arm. Now, supper ended at 10 o'clock, and if you were like most people on that April 14th, 1912, you probably went to bed shortly after. But at 11:40 p.m., you would be rudely roused from your slumber. There were 4 of us sleeping in the same apartment. We had a bed of our own, and in every apartment there were 4 life belts, one for each person. At the time when the ship got struck, I heard a terrible noise. I jumped out of bed and told my comrades there was something wrong, but they only laughed. I turned on the gas, and to my surprise, there was a small stream of water running along the floor. I had only just dressed myself when the sailors came along shouting, "All up on deck, unless you want to get drowned." That was third-class passenger Daniel Buckley, and he was in one of those forward cabins. And if you were up there, you would have likely felt the iceberg as well, and very soon afterwards seen water on the floor. Many of the men up there felt it and put on their lifebelts right away and headed down what was known as Scotland Road, which was a long corridor connecting the front to the back of the ship. They went back to the third-class smoking room, which was all the way aft, but many of the men who were back there hadn't really felt the iceberg and definitely hadn't seen any water, and so they weren't taking it seriously. They mocked the men for wearing the lifebelts, and there were stewards who instructed the men to actually remove the lifebelts. Now, while the third class was not forced to stay below decks, they were encouraged to stay in one place and await further instructions from the crew. But as the crew went out onto deck and started loading lifeboats, they got distracted and never went back down to tell the third class passengers what to do. And by the time the third class passengers realized this, it was too late and the last of the lifeboats was gone. Though Daniel Buckley, having seen the water in his room, did not wait for instructions. I went on deck and met a sailor who asked me to help him lower the boats. The sailor said, "Take a chance yourself." I did, as did my friend, but the officers came along and ordered us off the boat. A woman said, "Lay down, lad. You are somebody's child." She put a rug over me and the boat went out, so I was saved. Gershon Cohen, another third-class passenger, said that he didn't have a lifebelt in his room, but he wasn't that worried because when he went to the general room, everyone was dancing and singing, and nobody seemed that worried. It was only when he too went out on deck and saw ice all over the place that he realized the gravity of the situation. He actually climbed up onto the first-class deck and started searching for a lifebelt, which took him 30 minutes before he found one. I had just put it on when the boat tilted right over and a lot of people fell into the water and were drowned. I clung to the railings of the deck for dear life, and I was about 200 feet above the level of the water. Also below him was the very last lifeboat leaving the Titanic, and he tried to get on it by jumping out 5 feet to the lowering rope, but the rope cut through his gloves and his hands, and he too fell into the water. After being 5 minutes in the water, it seemed hours, I was dragged into the last lifeboat. There was nearly all women and children and 3 men. I was given one of the oars to pull the boat. We had to pull very hard because the Titanic was sinking and suction would pull us all down. We know a lot less about what was happening on the Titanic during the very last minutes, but there are a few stories from survivors who were pulled from the water. One tells of a third-class passenger running through the general room on his way to try to get out of the ship, and the room was empty except for a woman and her young child. She was sitting at the piano, playing and singing a song to her child, trying to keep them calm, she being resigned to their fate. Now, of the over 700 third-class passengers, 536 died that night, more than any other class. Though it was actually the crew that suffered the most loss, and we'll do an entire episode covering the crew at large, but in the next mini episode I'm going to talk about one crew member specifically, the baker, this guy from the 1997 movie. But before we move on from third class, I wanted to tell one more first-hand account, and I was actually not going to because it's really strange and can seem almost callous. But after reflecting on it, I realized that it shows an aspect of humanity that none of the other accounts have. It's a letter from Bertha Mulvihill to her sister Maud, and Bertha wrote this on the Carpathia, which was the ship that picked up the survivors after the actual sinking, is when she's writing this letter. And I don't know if she was in shock or just disbelief or what, but it's fascinating. Dear Maud, experience is great. I'm fine and dandy, never better. What time did you hear of the disaster? I am so glad I was in it. I shall never forget it. I never saw such a sight as when the dear old Titanic sank. She broke in 2 pieces. The scene was awful. Don't think me mad for being so happy to witness the sight. I am awfully happy, like the night I was born. Never felt happier in my life. Go figure. Now, I could tell countless stories from the third class on that fateful April night, but as it happens, it's time to spice up our rice soup. So once the rice is nice and soft, add in the salt, cayenne pepper, and the mace, and then pour in the cream. And stir it while you bring it back to a boil for 1 minute. And then it's ready to serve. And here we are, rice soup as served to third-class passengers aboard the Titanic. It smells really good. It's so interesting because it's kind of soup and it's kind of porridge. It's like in this kind of weird middle place, especially once you add the cream. But let's give it a shot. Oh, weird. Interesting. So the mace really hits you first. It's that and the chicken stock. Those are the dominant flavors, which is interesting for a soup or any kind of dish. It's an odd combination. And then, after a couple seconds, you don't get the flavor of the cayenne, but you get the heat of the cayenne, which is really interesting, especially from food of this time period. You don't really think of it as spicy, but it is. I have to say, it's weird, but it's also good, and wow, it would be so filling. And you know, it's the first of quite a large meal, but the meals after this, we're gonna cover the other classes, they get huge. This is a tiny meal in comparison to what we're gonna cover in future episodes. So I hope you're as excited as I am about Titanic Month. I've wanted to do it for a very long time, so I'm very glad that it's here, and I will see you next time on Titanic Month on Tasting History.